Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shills, dust slicers, peasants, vassals, peasants. I'm a useful idiot, and today I would like to do a video turning into a running series. Today's episode is China is not our enemy. In fact, I was debating whether to call the video China is not our enemy or we are not going to war with China. And I know a lot of people don't feel that way, but let me run by some information and some context. And for right now, a bunch of recent stories about China, and let's piece this together. So some interesting stories that all reflect a certain theme to me, and that is the intertwinement of Chinese interests and American interests. And certainly we know that's true on the corporate level, but now there seems to be a little cross-pollination going on in American and Chinese culture. And here's a roundup of some of these stories. We have China buying up a lot of distressed property in the United States right now, but of course there's a lot of it. And one example is in Toledo, where they bought a marina district, a 70-acre marina district, an aging hotel, and a restaurant complex. And not only that, they're building a Little China city south of Toledo, which is a 200-acre China city with lakes, a cultural center, and housing for Chinese citizens. Sort of an odd development. Then we have the disturbing story of counterfeit Chinese electronic parts used in military equipment. And they said that 70% of the up to 1 million parts that we get from China a year are counterfeit and don't work. So how interesting is that in itself, that we buy sensitive equipment that we use in our war machine from the Chinese? And remember that point, because this is going to come up again later. And now we have China, of course, setting up all sorts of oil deals in the Americas and North America and South America, including buying Texas oil fields in 2010. And, of course, they're buying up lots of tar sands up in Canada as well. And then recently, China was exempt from the sanction against Iran. So China and Singapore were given exemptions from the Iran sanctions. So that's kind of interesting. Then recently also, China for the first time is buying treasuries direct from the U.S. Treasury and not through middlemen. So this is a very unique relationship as well, with Chinese being able to buy treasuries right from Timothy Geithner himself. And then, of course, we have the relationship between China and GM, where GM essentially is now a Chinese company with huge operations over there in China, and of course a great deal of sales there now in China. And then there's a story that came out that a lot of U.S. roads are being built by Chinese companies. And this is in New York, California, and Alaska, where Chinese companies are contracted as they bid for these projects, and they come in and they bring Chinese labor. So they're helping rebuild the infrastructure in America. Another interesting thing, considering China's considered an enemy, don't you think? And then we have one of the biggest corporate buyouts of a Chinese company, AMC Entertainment movie chain. So now China owns a huge string of theaters across America showing huge blockbusters. And another interesting cross-pollination that makes you think, odd connection for someone who is supposedly our enemy. And then we have the new Chinese rich snapping up luxury apartments in New York. So they're obviously putting roots into the U.S. and well, they should. And China owns $2 trillion in U.S. debt. And of course, that's the fact that underlines everything. And there's some speculation out there about what would happen if China dumped a bunch of U.S. debt on the market and trashed our economy. But of course, that won't really happen because they have as much to lose as we do. The relationship between China and the U.S. now is so symbiotic that we're in it together now. And that's also part of my quotient about where we are with China. And as usual, I like to give a little historical background. But I'm not going to go back too far into one of the oldest civilizations on planet Earth, going back some 3,000 or 4,000 years or more. And, of course, many dynasties and periods of warlords and quite a interesting and storied history, including the construction of the Great Wall of China. But anyway, I'm going to start more in the modern times because something that happened in the 1820s is still relevant to what's happening now. That's an important theme in a lot of my videos discussing American foreign policy towards other countries. We need to bear in mind the context of history. It has everything to do with where we're at. A good example of this is all the borders in the Middle East being arbitrarily set up by colonial powers who had no concept of the ethnic divisions they were creating. So instead of having a Kurdish state, we have Kurdish populations in 3 to 4 to 5 countries. We have the Shiites and Sunnis split up. And here we are now still dealing with the fact that Shiites and Sunnis are together arbitrarily and artificially through colonized days when they were colonized. So anyway, let's get back to 1820s. And Britain had an arrangement with China where no foreigners were allowed in China, and there was one port available for trade. And that's the way the Chinese liked it. And incidentally, that's the way Japan handled things at first as well. But by the 1820s, of course, opium was being smuggled into China. And this arrangement is kind of complex. I'm going to try and make it as simple as possible. But essentially, the British, one way they could afford goods that they would get from China is they would import opium from British-controlled India. And this opium would be taken to Chinese ports by British ships and then smuggled in by local Chinese. And that was how a lot of British debt was paid. In spite of that, the Chinese still had a huge trade advantage. So anyway, by the time the 1840s rolled around, 1,400 tons of opium were being brought to China every year. And of course, the Chinese puppet government was alarmed about the fact that this is what the merchant arrangement and open ports were being used for, and having opium smuggled in, which was illegal in China. And so anyway, there was a debate in the Chinese court whether to suppress it or whether to legalize and tax it, which probably would have been the best idea. But instead they suppressed it, which included destroying foreign-owned stock. So this is where it gets interesting and where it gets relevant, because the British reaction to having this opium stock destroyed was to land an army of 20,000 and bring the British fleet to ravage the Chinese coast. So then the Chinese ended up suing for peace, and the terms were a forced opium trade on China. So that opium was forced to be marketed in China, and that is when Hong Kong and Macau were also ceded and other territory to the British Empire. The British fixed all Chinese tariffs, gave China a most favored nation clause, and wanted diplomats. So this is a result of what are called the Opium Wars from 1839 to 1842 and from 1856 to 1866. And the Chinese were defeated, and this is the beginning of when China was divided up between all the Western powers. So soon after this arrangement was made for the British Empire, and this is an important point too, the United States and France also got similar terms as a result of the British operation. This began what China calls the Century of Humiliation. So from essentially 1820s to the 1920s, China felt like it was under foreign boot, and it was. And this is important, and this is why I bring this sort of thing up, is because this is an important part of Chinese history, an important part of why they feel the mistrust they do of the Western world. Because you have to remember that through the 19th century, the Chinese nation was essentially occupied by a string of foreign powers, which included the British, French, the Germans, the Austrians, the Japanese, and the United States. And this is a period that lasted for nearly 100 years. And by the time the Western powers got out of the country, they soon became under Japanese occupation. So the Japanese had been making incursions into China into the 20s and then invaded China in 1931, 10 years before the United States entered the war. So Japan invaded China and the Western world did nothing. So China was on its own against the Japanese Empire. We pay attention to our involvement starting in 1941, but they had already experienced 10 years of war. So, and of course, this ushered in the clash between the nationalists and the communists in China. And the communists and the nationalists created a united front against Japanese occupation from 1931 until 1945. And then following Japanese expulsion from China, a very particularly brutal occupation. One can study just what is called the rape of Nanking to know the ferocity of the Japanese invasion of China. And another thing to bear in mind when you analyze the Chinese, what they went through during the Japanese occupation, a loss of 20 million lives, is quite a devastating impact on their culture. So they have no trust for the Western world, and then they have no trust for the Japanese, and they well shouldn't. In fact, they have a pretty good relationship with Japan right now, all things considered. That's another story. So after World War II ended, of course, the clash between the nationalists and the communists picked up right where it left off in 1945, and by 1949, the communists under Mao Zedong had dominated. And here's another crucial chapter in Chinese history that we need to bear in mind now, because it still has bearing to this day and is the potential flashpoint between relationship between the United States and China. And that is the fact that when the nationalists lost in mainland China, they congregated on an island used to be called Formosa and is now known as Taiwan, and set up an alternate nationalist Chinese government. And Mao Zedong and the communists took over mainland China, and that relationship exists to this day. And China has always considered Formosa and Taiwan a renegade Chinese province, which essentially it is. So it's important to know that through propaganda and history revisionism, Americans' view generally of Taiwan is similar to that with Israel. We have to defend them at all costs. And in actual historical fact, mainland China won fair and square. They have every right to claim that nationalist China or Taiwan is a renegade province. And their goal to eventually reunite with Taiwan is a worthy one. And I think through time, as China moderates the attractiveness to Taiwan to become part of the mainland again, could be a reality without a shot being fired. But right now, it is a potential flashpoint because China and the U.S. have always used that as the pinpoint for a potential showdown, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. But I would suggest that Chinese are very patient. They have a very, very long history, and they will wait us out. They will wait till the time when Taiwan becomes one with China on their own accord. That's the way I feel. And so anyway, that sort of brings us to where we are now, except for, of course, Mao Zedong died, and China moved on. And by the 1978, they actually opened up to free market principles, and that's when their economy started exploding and getting the likes of 10% growth per year, which, you know, over this last 20, 30-year period is a substantial amount of growth. And so anyway, this began about 79, 80 when they opened up to more free market principles. So they're more of a mixed economy now. A lot of people still think they're more of a totalitarian central plan. And they are central planned. They have a lot of free market principles and capitalism in their system now. So so let's look at some of the other facts about China. In 2010, they became the largest energy consumer in the world, 70%, which is coal, and that's one reason why they have so much pollution in China. But they surpassed everyone else and became the largest energy consumer in 2010. They have 1 billion cell phone users, and 600 million people have the internet. So technology is really taking hold in China. They obviously are more middle class than a lot of Americans assume, and obviously that is the kind of market that transnational corporations have their eyeball on. So, and that's a very, very important factor in my overall suggestion that China is not our enemy, and that we will not go to war with China, because they are the prize. They are the economic prize in the world now. 1,338 million people in their country, the largest market in the world that has all the businessmen on the planet drooling. They have an unemployment of 10%, which is pretty good considering the size of their population. And only 10% of their population is below the poverty line. And there's a good example of how free market principles helped a lot in China. In 1978, 64% of their population was below the poverty line. And that's the stereotype that a lot of people still have of China. So now we have only 10% of their population is below the poverty line, which might even be considerably better than the percentage here in the United States now. And another thing that free markets did in China is in 1978, 17% of the people lived in cities. And not very many, but by 2012 now, 46% of the people in China live in the cities. So they are making a move to urban areas, much like trends all over the world. And they have 650 million people still living in rural areas and farming communities. So agriculture is still a huge proportion of their domestic markets. And they are now projected to be twice the size of the U.S. economy by 2020. That's only 8 years away. I don't necessarily see that happening either. There's some problems in China right now, but we'll discuss that in a little bit. But there's a disparity in population size between the U.S. and China, and that needs to be pointed out. So when you look at China's growth rate and their GDP, and you look at the U.S. and our growth rate in GDP, we have to remember that we have 300 million people, and China has 1,300,000,000 people. So that has a distorting effect on a lot of numbers. So just bear that in mind. And one of the other things that China has is the highest reserve requirements in the world for their banks. And also, of course, we know that they encourage their citizens to buy gold. So they're aware of trying to protect their citizens and protect their banking system from the excess and greed of Western banks, although I'm sure they have plenty of their own. And then we have constant changes in government. And so this period of, in the dynasties in early China, so this relative level of stability with non-foreign interference that they've had for the last 100 years is pretty remarkable. And so let's remember that it's pretty new for them. Up until 60 years ago, they had known nothing but occupation through the 19th and 18th centuries. So it was only after 1945 that China got into its own and became master of its own destiny. So that's important to remember too when we're thinking about what is the Chinese attitude towards the West. So then we have, and I should mention too, the purge of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Revolution from 1945 to 1949, and then the Great Leap Forward after that, resulted in 45 million deaths. So China paid a very heavy price. So let's remember they lost 20 million in the Japanese occupation, and then they lost another 45 million people during their own revolution. So this is a population that has should have earned their respect, and they paid a high price in blood to get to where they are today. And of course, the last episode that people remember about China is the Tiananmen Square protests and killings in 1989. And of course, they've come a long way since then too. But let's remember that they're a state, just like so many states, and they will take the measures they need to take to keep order in their society. And that's an unfortunate fact of state. and should be no reflection on the Chinese government per se, because when you discuss human rights, they have every right to question the United States lecturing them when we actually have more people in prison relative to our population than China does. And, so anyway, but let's get back to some other interesting facts about China right now. The middle class is up to 100 million people now. And the middle class in China, of course, is $17,000 a year, but that money goes a long way in China, so let's not judge that. But they have 100 million people in their middle class, which, granted, is not that much in a population of a billion, nearly a billion and a half. But that said, they have 825,000 millionaires now and 600 billionaires, which is pretty staggering, but once again, fairly minimal compared to the size of their population. But they are the second largest consumer of luxury goods after Japan. So they're getting a taste for this luxuriant capitalist life. And they're young and rich, live high style. And they live high style right there in China. And they don't necessarily have to go to Hong Kong and Macau. And then they have 4 of the world's top 10 most valuable companies. And of course, just like the rest of the world, those top companies are in construction and banks and oil. So there's a lot of similarities between China and the Western world. So let's go down where we're at right now. So we see that China's had a history of division and warfare and occupation and colonialism and humiliation. They've only recently entered into the 20th century and became a country that controlled its own destiny. So they have a lot of mistrust, well-deserved, of Japan and most notably the United States and Europe. And well, they should. And I think it's interesting to point out, too, that their military is substantial. And they have a high percentage of what they spend of their GDP on the military, but it's nothing compared to the United States, of course. And it's interesting, too, that they know that their only potential enemy is the U.S. And that's a sad state of affairs when the United States feels like we have enemies all over the world. And China realizes its only enemy is the United States. A sad commentary. So their military capabilities are about deflecting America's capabilities. So they don't try to compete with us directly. They just try to counter what we have. So they know our military relies on satellite system and communication, so they have developed lasers and missiles that will take that capability out. So they're very counter strategic here. And there's a lot of saber rattling. I think both our government and their government has to posture for our bases, for their respective bases. So they rattle their sword for the Chinese base, and our government rattles its sword for the American base. And I don't really think it's for real. I think that's posturing by both sides, and I think it's also to help both of them justify very lucrative, economically sound military buildups. And it will give the United States, of course, the legitimacy or the ability to justify having a huge conventional military still in a post-World War II world. And also just the ties between the United States and China and their investments here on such a macro level, and their interest in basically getting involved in all aspects of investment in American society. And I would say at some point we're going to see more integration of America into China as well. So as the time goes on, I see flashpoints like we see now in Syria, although I would say I don't believe China is going to get directly involved in that conflict. And in fact, I don't think there will be a war. Let's look at the reality that corporations control the United States government. Corporations control foreign policy. All the wars going on in the world now are economic wars and are based on the interests of transnational corporations, too big to fail banks, and the military-industrial complex. Their interest is limited as far as going to war with China. I don't think they want their prize, the biggest potential consumer market in the world, I don't think they want to have it bombed. That's just my gut feeling. And so I just want people to think about that. I think I've made my case that China is not our enemy. They have every reason to believe that we are their enemy. And let's remember, too, that China doesn't have military bases anywhere else in the world but China. China doesn't import their values. They import construction, finance, technology. And they're about business. And they don't meddle in other countries' internal affairs. And there's a lot to be said for that. So let's see who the provocateur here is. And I don't believe it's China. So for that reason, I say that China is not our enemy. And I say that we will not go to war to China. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.